Hello and welcome all. Thank you so much for joining today's training called the Golden Ticket, Accessing Financial Aid for Refugee Youth and Adults. This training is presented by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. My name is Meg Gibbon and I am Switchboard's Deputy Director. I'm joined by a co-host today, Rebecca Mulqueen, who is Switchboard's Project Manager, and you'll be hearing from Rebecca in the chat throughout today's training. I'd like to start by mentioning that this training is being recorded. It will run for 1 hour and 30 minutes, and you'll be able to find the recording on our website in about 24 hours. You'll receive a link sent to you via email at that time, and you'll find the webinar transcript on our website in a few days. So a few quick logistics here in Zoom before we get started. I know we're all quite familiar with Zoom these days, but it might be helpful to some to get a quick refresher. So you'll find your phone and computer audio settings on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You can switch between those at any time if you're having any technical issues. We'd love to hear from you via the chat today, so use the chat function to send messages. If you choose all panelists and all attendees, you'll be able to reach everyone who's joining today. Everyone on the line except for our panelists is currently muted because we're expecting a large group, so please use the chat function available to you to speak with everyone who is participating. You also have the Q&A function where you can type a question, or you can click the thumbs up icon to vote for another participant's question, and we will use the most voted questions as we get into our Q&A section. All right, with that, I am so pleased to introduce today's speaker. Lindsay Dusard is a program associate at AnLar an education research consulting firm where she works on projects for the U.S. Department of Education and Administration for Children and Families. Prior to her role at AnLar, Lindsay managed academic and college readiness programming, serving recently resettled youth at the IRC in Silver Spring, Maryland. Lindsay, I will turn it over to you to talk about today's objectives.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Having assisted many clients through completing the FAFSA, I know this process can be very frustrating at times, but at the same time, I've seen firsthand over and over how accessing financial aid can really dramatically alter the outcomes for resettled youth and adults. And for that reason, I'm very excited to walk through this content with you all today in hopes that it will enable more folks to be able to access their post-secondary education and ultimately pursue their goals here in the United States. Today, we're going to be covering a wide range of information, starting with defining some key terms related to financial aid and the eligibility determinants. We're going to summarize the federal financial aid opportunities available to ORR-eligible populations. We're going to walk through the federal financial, the free application for federal student aid, and then we're going to really dive into some of the common obstacles that ORR-eligible populations face when completing that application and the guidance provided by FSA in order to overcome those. And then lastly, just go through some additional resources that are available to you, your clients, your colleagues to support this process. All right, so we have quite a bit of content that we're going to cover today, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to get to a Q&A session at the end with representatives from the U.S. Department of Education. So as we go through, I'm going to pause after each section. That will be a great time for you to submit any questions that you have. We will be covering all of those questions at the end during the Q&A session, including those that were pre-submitted during the registration process. I will only have time to summarize a lot of this information. There's quite a lot to get through, but I will touch on this more at the end, but I've also developed a toolkit that really goes more in depth and provides more explanation on these different topics that you'll be able to refer to moving forward, and that will be available on the Switchboard website as well. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start off by asking a few quick poll questions to get to know a little bit more about your background and experience so we can kind of direct the conversation. The first question should be up on your screen. It's which best describes your role in supporting clients' access to post-secondary education? a moment to answer. Okay, awesome. We have quite a diversity of experience. I think that will lead to some really great conversation at the end. All right, the next poll is in a similar vein. We're looking at what type of organization are you affiliated with? A more traditional VOLAG, a community-based organization, institution of higher education, state agency, or other. We would love to hear from you in the chat. Okay, fantastic. Great to see the representation here. All right, and the last one is just getting to know a little bit more about your current confidence level. So we're going to dive into a lot of different topics today. How would you rate your confidence supporting clients and obtaining financial aid going into this webinar? Okay, great. I'm glad to see the diversity here too. So we knew that folks were going to have a wide range of experience navigating this process with clients. So we're really going to start with the basics. To start off, though, I do want to clarify that we are going to be focusing on ORR-eligible clients. So refugees, individuals who have been granted asylum, Afghan and Iraqi SIVs, Cuban Haitian entrants, and victims of trafficking. We'll be happy to address questions relating to other statuses and their eligibility at the end, but just keep that in mind as we're going through. I'll be sure to note if there are differences in terms of what statuses qualify and don't qualify for certain provisions under FSA policy as we go. All right, so to get started, what is financial aid? Financial aid is money that students can use to help pay for college and career school. So these funds can be used to cover expenses related to school, such as tuition, room and board, books and supplies, transportation, etc. You can see here that there are a variety of different forms of financial aid, some of which students are required to pay back following the completion of their studies and others that are not. There are also a variety of sources of financial aid. So that can come from the federal government, state governments, there are private organizations that offer scholarships and grants to students, local governments often may offer different opportunities as well. And then another big chunk is coming from the institution. Today, we're going to primarily focus our time on federal student aid. Federal student aid is often the base of what other organizations, such as state, local, and schools, base their financial awards off of. So this is a great starting place. It also is a great opportunity for a lot of the clients that we work with, and we'll talk through more specifics about that as we go through. Okay, to start off, we'll go through the different forms of federal student aid. I'll refer to federal student aid as FSA as we go through. Federal student aid is a branch of the US Department of Education that's responsible for administering Title IX financial aid. There are several different programs, many of which are determined based on financial need. And so the first, most commonly accessed by ORR clients is the Pell Grant. Currently, students can receive up to $6,495 per academic year to support their studies. Additionally, there's another grant called the Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant. And this is funding that's allocated directly to an institution of higher education. And then that institution is the one that allocates to their students based on the need of the students within their school. Students can receive up to $4,000 per academic year, but it's important to note that this is based on the institution's allocations. And so that's not something that's going to be known to the student typically until close to the school year starts. There are also several different types of federally sponsored loans that students can access, some of which are subsidized and others that are not. It's important when talking to clients about loans, especially in terms of their education, to understand what a financial commitment that is. There are several resources available to students on the federal student aid website to help understand how that loan will grow over time due to interest, what their payment options look like, those sort of things. And then the last federal student aid opportunity is federal work study. And so these are designated positions on and off campus for students that demonstrate financial need. And so only those students that qualify are able to obtain those different positions. Students would apply for those positions directly through their institution or through their the partner organizations within their local communities. And it's important to note that this money does not need to be repaid and it can be used at the discretion of the student. All right, so who should apply for federal student aid? There are several different eligibility determinants in order to be considered for federal student aid. Some important ones that we'll want to note for today is eligible citizen status, being enrolled at least half time in a qualifying program, maintaining satisfactory academic progress, and having a high school diploma or completing one of the ability to benefit alternatives. You can see those highlighted there. In addition, students in order to apply will need to have a valid social security number, as well as be administered by the selective services if the applicant is male. And like we mentioned at the beginning, most of these programs are based on financial need. And so demonstrating that is also an important qualifier. All right. So the definition as defined by FSA of an eligible non-citizen covers the ORR-eligible statuses as well. So for Afghan and Iraqi SIVs, they would be considered US permanent residents upon arrival. Refugees, asylum granted, Cuban Haitian entrants, status pending, and victims of human trafficking. Another requirement that's noted there is being enrolled at least half time. So it's important to know that each school may have a different specification for what qualifies as half-time enrollment. It's also important to note here that Pell Grants are awarded based on the semester or quarter hours enrolled. So for instance, if a student is enrolled less than full time, they won't be able to receive the full Pell Grant funding. And the last one here, which is also could be especially relevant to ORR clients, is being enrolled in an eligible career pathways program. And it's just ensuring that it must consist of two connected education components and adult education component integrated with a Title IX eligible post-secondary program component. All right. So before we get into the application process, we want to define a few terms that will help support that conversation. So the free application for federal student aid is the application that students use to apply for student aid. The application that students and their parents complete, if required, is used to determine the eligibility. It's typically completed online. However, it can be completed by hand and mailed in. The amount and type of student aid a student is eligible for is determined by their own, and if they're dependent, their parents' income from the previous calendar year. We're going to discuss dependency a little bit more moving on later on today. But in order to calculate, and validate household income, FSA primarily relies on IRS records. And so to save time for students, they can directly import previous year's tax information using the IRS direct data retrieval tool that's integrated into the web application. If for whatever reason you're having difficulty accessing the IRS, then you can just enter that information from the form 1040 and the W-2s in order to complete the application. Federal student aid is calculated based on the expected family contribution. And so this is the amount used to calculate it. This is looking at how much the family is likely to be able to support the student in their financial pursuits. It's calculated based on the number in the household, the parent income, student income, etc. The student aid report is generated once the student submits an application online, or if they've mailed it in, once the application has been received and processed. It includes their predicted eligibility and the estimate of their aid package, especially for the Pell Grant, which is definitely important information. These numbers are really helpful in supporting students as they navigate their choices for post-secondary education. And similarly, the last one noted here is the institutional student information report. And this is a summary of student information that's submitted through the FAFSA, but rather being sent to the student. This is sent directly to the institutions that the student lists in their application. The FAFSA has 7 sections broken down, but they mainly fall into these 4 main categories. So the first is student identifying information and school selection. So in this section, students will enter information such as their SSN, ARN, information if they are married, their parents' education level. They'll also select the schools that they would be interested in applying to. We strongly encourage students to enter any school that they're considering, because otherwise that institution will not receive their student aid report. So if they're considering several different options, make sure that they're listing all of them in that section. The next is looking at student dependency. And so we're really going to dive into what that means moving forward. But typically, if a student is under the age of 24, they're required to report parent information as well. If they are under the age of 24, that parent information section has information regarding their identifying information, previous year's earnings, looking at their public benefits summary and what they accessed. Some things here that get a little tricky are date of marriage. We've worked with clients, it takes quite a long time for them to find that information. Parents' education level, things like that as well will be reported here. And then the last section is looking at student financial information. And so if a student is a dependent, they're typically not required to report that information. However, if they have worked, then they'll want to import their information as well. All right. So as you can see by this graphic, the FAFSA is open from October 1st, prior to the aid year, all the way through June 30th at the end of the aid year. So it is open for almost the entirety of that potential school year that a student would desire to apply for aid. So this means if a client arrives in the fall and would like to access federal student aid in the spring, they would still be able to apply as long as their institution is still accepting applications. And so as we get into more in the challenges sections, we're going to see that states and institutions are really given the autonomy to set their own deadlines and policies in many cases for when things must be submitted by. And so you can see with the pink lines underneath, sometimes an institution will set a deadline for submitting the FAFSA in early spring to be considered for financial awards. So it's really important as you're supporting clients through this process that you're paying attention to all the different applicable deadlines. Like I said earlier, since many of these other institutions and state-based awards are based on information submitted in the FAFSA, you would want to make sure that you're applying as soon as possible. Really strongly recommend that you're supporting clients, if possible, right after that application opens in October to make sure that every student is, eligible to receive the full amount that they are, eligible for. Okay. So once this FAFSA has been submitted, FSA conducts several different matches with federal agencies, including the Social Security Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, and Department of Justice, et cetera. Specifically for non-eligible or eligible non-citizens, I apologize, information is sent to the Social Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security to conduct those matches. If information is not available in that system for whatever reason, or if information may have been entered incorrectly, et cetera, the institution will be required to complete a third step verification of the student's legal status. So it's possible that an institution would request that an individual submit proof of their legal status. Some things here to note are that victims of trafficking will always fail this matching process. And the students will need to provide their certification of eligibility letter to the institution directly. And the financial aid will need to contact DHS in order to DHS to verify their eligibility. Another note regarding students' rights, students are required, or schools are required to give students up to 30 days to provide immigration documentation in which a school cannot deny, reduce, or terminate their aid. So keep that in mind. Okay, so verification is another step that this is where things get a little tricky. So about 30 applications are, or 30% of applications are selected by FSA central processing system for further verification of the information submitted. It's really important that students are paying attention to their school accounts, their emails, etc., for requests from the financial aid offices regarding additional information to support the information reported in their application. And so there are currently 3 different verification groups. While it's possible that a student would never be requested to present this information, it's good to know what could potentially be required of them. And so that's why we're going to discuss this a little bit here. For instance, a lot of times if a student is reporting information, they'll need to provide the actual copies of the tax returns of information collected, household size, number in college, incomes earned from work, etc. You may also be a student may also be required to verify their high school completion status via transcript or diploma. The last one is a similar one, but also includes the statement of educational purpose. We're going to get into this a lot more in the next section, but it's important to note here as well. During documentation, institutions will always seek the most official documentation possible. And so special accommodations have been written into FSA policy to accommodate students that are in unusual circumstances, which is often the case for the clients that we work with. In these situations, typically a written statement will be accepted if no formal proof can be provided. And we'll get into more of the specifics, like I said, in the next section, specifically in terms of foreign tax returns and dependency. So I'm going to pause for a moment. Please take a second to submit any questions that you might have. I imagine that you have more questions now than when you started. We will be getting into more of the commonly encountered challenges in the next section, and hopefully we'll be able to answer those as we go. But please take a second to enter any thoughts that you have now.
Just chiming in here to say you also have the option to vote for others' questions. So if you have a similar question to one that's already in the Q&A, click the thumbs up icon, which will help us see who is most interested in different topics.
Okay, so similar to much of our work, things are not always easy. In this next section, we are going to walk through several of the common challenges that ORR-eligible clients encounter when submitting their FAFSA. We're going to go through the 5 most commonly encountered and look at what the federal student aid policy says, and then talk about ways that clients can navigate those challenges. As a kind of overarching theme, this always involves a lot of communication with the institution's financial aid office. And so in general, would really encourage your organization as a whole to build relationships with local community colleges and state institutions so that you can support clients and have a kind of a direct means of communication with those offices. So the 5 challenges that we're going to cover have to do with dependency, like we mentioned earlier, whether the parent or self did not pay taxes in the US in the previous year, which that expected family contribution is based off of. If a client is not able to present proof of high school completion due to conflict and displacement, If a bachelor's degree is not recognized in the US, and still being eligible for some of those grant programs, and the communication entrance with expiring parole and how to navigate that. So first, we're going to talk about dependency. So as described earlier, awards are calculated based on expected family contribution. If a student is under the age of 24, they are asked to report student information and income. And we know that our clients can have unusual circumstances due to conflict and displacement. There are several pre-qualified exemptions to reporting parent information that are listed here, several of which could be relevant to the clients that we work with, whether a client is married, if they have children that they provide more than half of their support for, if the parents are deceased, or if the child or the student was in legal guardianship when they were younger or currently. If a student does not neatly fit one of these areas, they can also qualify under some different means. So an institution can provide a student dependency override for unusual circumstances if a student is unable to locate their parents due to conflict or displacement. Documentation in this section is really critical for supporting the override process. So steps to ensure the successful processing application. So if this client that you're working with is able to select one of those pre-qualified independent student qualifiers, make sure they do that. Select all that are applicable. If they aren't able to select one of those, there will be an option when moving into the parent information section to say, I'm unable to provide information about my parents. You can click that and that will allow you to skip the student information section. You will receive a warning that says that not providing parent information will disqualify you for Pell Grant funding, for other grant funding, and for some of the subsidized loan options, anything that's based on financial need. However, even though it will be initially rejected, once you have enrolled in the institution or the student has enrolled in the institution, they can work with that institution by providing documentation of their circumstances, and the institution can then conduct that dependency override, which will then allow them to be eligible for those grant and subsidized loan opportunities. Another quick note here on dependency, it's possible that you're working with a student that has an eligible status, but their parent does not. When submitting the FAFSA, to sign the FAFSA, you have to create an FSA ID. To create an FSA ID, you have to have an active social security number. And so if a parent does not have an eligible status and does not have a social security number, you would want to enter all zeros for the parent. Do not enter the taxpayer identification number in that field. And then rather than submitting it electronically, you can print that signature page and mail it in, and the FAFSA will still be processed. The student will still be eligible for those programs, although it's important to note that they will not be eligible for the Parent Plus loans, which is one of those loan programs. For that program, both the parent and student must have eligible legal status. All right, the next section we're going to cover is looking at whether did not pay taxes in the previous year. So there are kind of three different buckets that folks can fall into regarding this. So the first is that a family has been in the United States, they pay their taxes. It should be a relatively easy process as long as they maintain the documentation of their tax returns, or if they're able to use that IRS data retrieval tool. If a client did not file and their parent did not file in the US for whatever reason, then they would want to select not going to file for that question. They'll be then asked to enter any income information that they do have, and will be asked for specific items on the tax form, or won't be asked for those specific items on the tax form. It's also possible that an individual did not file taxes in the US because they were in a foreign country, and that does not require individuals to file tax returns. In that case, they'll enter information. They'll still select not going to file, enter information, and submit a signed statement certifying their income. And then the last option is if that individual was in a foreign country that is required to file taxes. The institutions can accept transcripts from foreign government tax authorities in order to process this information. So again, if a client and parent, if applicable, did not file a tax return in the US or another country, they would select I'm not going to file for the question for 2019. Have your parent completed the IRS income tax return or another tax return? They will need to be prepared to submit proof of income, W-2, 1099, public benefits statements, etc. They will also want to be able to provide documentation about their arrival date and any other circumstances regarding their resettlement if they were in a foreign country during that time period. If a client did file taxes in their home or host country, you would select already completed and then select a foreign tax return. At that time, you will be able to enter converted monetary amounts from that tax return. You'll likely be asked to submit a copy of the tax return and other income information from your foreign country if selected for verification. The next challenge is not being able to provide proof of high school completion. So as we discussed at the beginning, one of those eligibility determinants for federal student aid is having completed high school or one of the alternative to benefit programs. Because in many cases, refugees, asylees, and victims trafficking are not able to or do not have the documentation available to them due to displacement, etc. FSA has written in policy into the handbook that allows for alternatives of reporting. And so in these rare cases, applicants can rather submit proof of their efforts to obtain that documentation and a signed and dated statement that indicates that the applicant completed secondary school in a foreign country, including some information about that school. They will also need to provide documentation of their status upon entry. And so this is one of those that is only applicable for refugees, asylees, and victims of trafficking. And we can discuss a little bit more at the end in terms of considerations for Afghan and Iraqi asylees for this situation. So as described, you will want to be able to show proof that you made attempts to obtain those records. So if there are family members, friends that are still in that area or country that you could request potentially visiting the school on your behalf, you can email or mail requests to the school. Even if you know those efforts are futile, it's still important to provide documentation of them. Of course, keeping in mind safety concerns here, and especially in terms of areas with active conflict, making sure that you're protecting your client first and foremost. The client will need to write a statement and sign, including the circumstances, the dates attended, the name and address of the school attended if possible, and then again submitting proof of immigration status upon arrival to the student's chosen institution. The next one is if the bachelor's degree is not recognized in the United States. So it's possible that you'll work with a client that has received a bachelor's degree in their home and host country, but upon evaluation in the United States, it's determined to not be equivalent to a US bachelor's degree. In order to receive Pell Grant funds, as well as some other funds, you must have not already completed a bachelor's degree. You must be working towards that first bachelor's degree or certificate or associate's degree, etc. So in this case, FSA has also provided policy directly regarding this. So to avoid any sort of penalty when completing the FAFSA, you'll want to select yes for the question that says, will you have your first bachelor's degree before you begin 2021-2022 school year? Upon admission, you would want to present that degree evaluation to the institution and request written documentation that they indeed do not recognize that degree as equivalent to a US bachelor's degree. At that point, you can request the school's financial aid office to make the correction to your application so that you will indeed be considered for those other opportunities, such as the Pell Grant and subsidized loan opportunities. All right, the last one here is Cuban Haitian entrance with expiring parole. So Cuban Haitian entrants have the special eligibility under the eligible non-citizens for FSA policy. They have a specific option to be selected within the system that they process immigration documents. And what often happens here is that individuals at a higher institution of higher education will select the wrong status. And so it's just really essential that you're communicating and having the client communicate the specific status that they received upon entry. So in that case, when completing the FAFSA, you would select I'm an eligible non-citizen, enter the accurate ARN and SSN, and then if selected for verification, you want to ensure that the financial aid office understands the client is a Cuban Haitian entrant, and if needed, refers to the Federal Student Aid Handbook for guidance on how to properly enter that documentation into the verification system. If applicable, if the client has applied for permanent residency, also provide a copy of the I-797 approval notice. Okay, I'll pause again here. Please take a moment to enter any questions as well as vote for other questions that you find relevant.
Thank you, Lindsay. And just chiming in to say we've received a lot of questions so far. Please do keep them coming. Thank you for all your really detailed questions about the different situations you've encountered. I have begun to mark a few that Lindsay did cover during the presentation, which will just help us try to navigate through these during our Q&A. But if you feel that you're still confused on a question I marked as answered, you can submit another one, and we will also do our best to get answers out via email to any questions we don't have time to cover today. One other note, just as a reminder, Lindsay did prepare a very detailed toolkit which covers the information that is in this presentation. So that'll be a reference guide for you all to take a look at these specific scenarios and get down into the details. So that link will be shared with you at the end of today's training. Oh, you're muted, Lindsay.
Apologize. So the last section, we're going to be looking at putting some of this knowledge into practice. And so looking at 3 different case study examples in which a client is encountering multiple issues in terms of verification and applying for FAFSA and accessing federal student aid. And then what would be the important steps to take to ensure that client's application is processed successfully. So our first example is about Shaista. Shaista is 21 years old and originally from Afghanistan. She and her parents were resettled as refugees in November 2020. Shaista graduated from high school in Afghanistan, but was unable to attain her academic records before leaving due to the Taliban's presence in the region. She plans to enroll in a community college in fall 2021 to pursue an associate degree in chemistry. Shaista's parents paid taxes in Afghanistan in 2019, and they do have copies of those records. So we're going to have a quick poll. So which challenges will Shaista likely encounter when applying for financial aid? Okay, great. So since she's still with her parents, we're not going to worry about dependency since they'll be able to report that information from their tax return. However, they did not file taxes in the US in the previous year. That's correct. And she does not have proof of high school completion with her. So to ensure that she can overcome the challenges, we'll want to make sure that she completes the following. So the first thing is when you're filling out the application, you would want to select already completed when the question asks about whether your parent has completed their tax return. You would then select a foreign tax return and enter the converted monetary amounts. And then again, make sure that since they do have the documentation with them, they would want to submit that if selected for verification. If you are working with a client that does not have access to that information, again, typically a statement of signed statement detailing the income, the amount of taxes paid, et cetera, and converted monetary amounts will typically be accepted. But again, you would want to work closely with the institution's financial aid office to make that determination. The next step in terms of accessing her financial or her high school records, if it is a safe option, try to email or mail a request to the secondary school in Afghanistan, maintaining any records of your efforts. You would want to write and sign a printed statement, including the circumstances, the dates attended, the name and address of the school, and then submit with that signed written statement, proof of immigration status upon arrival. And so, like I noted earlier, this accommodation is only allowed for refugees, asylees, and victims of trafficking at the moment. Something else to note here is that, again, all the way through, we want to make sure that we're working very closely with the institution's financial aid office to ensure that the documentation that's being presented is in accordance with their requirements. Okay, so our next example is about Virtue. Virtue is 23 years old and originally from Cameroon. She has worked as a cashier since being granted asylum in the US in 2018. In Cameroon, she completed a degree in business administration, a bachelor's degree, I'll note. She had her degree evaluated when she arrived, and it was not the equivalent of a US bachelor's degree. She would like to pursue an associate degree in information technology at her local community college and is hoping to be able to access Pell Grant funding. Virtue came to the US alone and now lives with roommates. She supports herself and has filed taxes each year. She has not spoken with her parents in 5 years due to ongoing conflict. So again, which of these challenges will Virtue likely encounter during the application process and verification? Okay, great. Looks like most of us got it correct. So dependency is an issue because she hasn't been able to contact her family. They will not be supporting her in any means in her pursuits of higher education in the US. And her bachelor's degree is not recognized in the US. And so that will present some challenges in her being able to access Pell Grant funds. So to ensure the successful processing of her application, what she'll want to do is because she doesn't fit into one of those pre-qualified exemptions, she's going to select I am unable to provide information about my parents. With that will allow her to skip that first section or the section about the parent information and income information. As we noted earlier, that will cause her application to be rejected for consideration for Pell Grant funding and other subsidized opportunities. In the toolkit that we've developed, we've included several templates to help clients complete these sort of written statements. So using one of those, that template, prepare, document, and submit documentation to the institution's financial aid office detailing your circumstances related to dependency. For this in particular, financial aid offices will typically request a third party to also verify the circumstances. In many cases, a resettlement agency would be able to act as that third party to provide further proof that the individual was resettled alone and it does not have contact with their parents. For the next portion, she would want to select yes for the FAFSA question 28 regarding whether or not she has received her first bachelor's degree. She would then present the evaluation that she had done to the institution in which she would need to receive their confirmation that the degree is indeed not equivalent according to their standards. And then the financial aid would be the one to make that correction to her application once the institution has indeed said that it is not equivalent. Once the institution has said that the first year, moving forward, the individual would be able to just select no for that question because if the individual stays at the same institution. But definitely for that first year, you would want to select yes so that your application is not denied or receive any penalty for providing misleading information. And again, as always, staying in contact with the institution's financial aid office throughout the process to ensure providing the appropriate documentation. I see a quick note about what question 28 is. 28 is referring to whether or not a client has completed their first bachelor's degree. And so in that case, we would say yes, even though it is not by US standards, and then the institution would make that correction to no so that they would be considered for Pell Grant funding. So for our last case study, we're looking at Mateo. He's 20 years old and originally from Cuba. He arrived in the United States with his aunt and uncle in the December of 2016 and was granted parole as a Cuban Haitian immigrant. Mateo's parents were killed when he was 7, and he has lived with his aunt and uncle since. They were his legal guardians until he turned 18. He plans to apply for permanent residency when he is eligible. Mateo graduated from high school in Cuba with honors. He has a copy of his transcript and diploma, and he plans to pursue a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering at his local state university. So based on this information, what challenges would Mateo likely encounter as he's applying for federal student aid? Okay, great. So since Mateo has been in the country for a while and has been working, he's been filing taxes. So we are not going to worry about that question. However, dependency and Cuban Haitian entrant with expiring parole are both potentially going to present challenges for Mateo. So to ensure that his application is processed successfully, when completing the FAFSA, he does fall into some of those pre-qualified exemptions for not submitting parent information. So he would select I am currently or I was in legal guardianship. And since I was 13, both of my parents were deceased in the student dependency section. And then that will allow him to automatically skip that section regarding parent information and income. And it's also just being prepared to submit documentation if requested from the institution relating those matters. In terms of the Cuban Haitian entrance status, ensure that you're entering accurate ARN and SSN information. Present documentation if selected for verification, and just ensure that the reviewer at the institution is aware of the special policy relating to Cuban Haitian parolees. All right, so I'll take a second to pause. Please feel free to enter any questions in the Q&A. And again, vote for those that are relevant to your needs. So last, we're going to get into additional resources and tips for supporting clients through this process. So like we mentioned at the beginning, and Meg also mentioned there in the middle, we've also developed a toolkit that provides far more comprehensive guidance relating to these issues, with links to where this information is found on the student aid website, as well as within the federal student aid handbooks, if there are situations where you need to be advocating on behalf of a client regarding some of these issues. With that said, it's important to keep in mind that institutions are able to establish their own policies relating to some of these things. And so it's important, as I've mentioned many times, to stay in close communication with them throughout this process to ensure that you're providing the information needed for that client to be able to access aid. So to provide a quick overview of what is included in that toolkit, there's an introduction to financial aid that talks through a lot of those definitions, the types of aid, eligibility determinants, walks through the verification process as well, and has that information that we talked about earlier. Talks about the timeline and application steps, things to consider, and a little bit more in-depth information about that review process and how things are calculated. And then it goes into it and provides all of that information, again, related to those commonly encountered challenges, including those direct links to the websites and Federal Student Aid Handbook. It also includes a section of frequently asked questions from multiple different perspectives, because we know there are lots of actors here. So questions that clients may ask regarding federal financial aid, questions that you might have as a service provider, and questions that financial aid professionals might ask you from an institution. There's also additional resources. So there's a wealth of information available online related to federal student aid, but would strongly encourage you to access information that is from verified sources. So there is a lot of fraud and fraudulent activity related to financial aid. So make sure that you're verifying the sources. Students are not providing information, identifying information to third parties that you have not verified to be legitimate, etc. So links to studentaid.gov, information for financial aid professionals is the site that institutions use in order to access FSA policy, and that's open to the public. So you're able to access that same information, including Dear Colleague letters, electronic announcements, handbooks, etc. And the last one is the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. And so they have put together two different toolkits, much shorter toolkits regarding supporting refugees and asylees through that process with some frequently asked questions, etc. So the links are included there. And then the last section are, again, some of those templates. It's just some skeleton outlines of what information should be included in those different types of documentation that may be requested when formal proof is not, when you're not able to provide formal proof. So here, just some more information. Again, like I said, the information for financial professionals is a great resource for folks to access. Studentaid.gov, also a great resource, includes FSA deadlines. You can also search by state deadlines to understand what other things to be aware of. It also has links to individual state education agencies for you to learn more about state-based opportunities. The loan simulator, which helps clients understand kind of the implications of taking out loans for their education. A chat feature that allows you to speak directly with help desk representatives. And there's also a mobile app that students can use to keep track of their process. All right, some last things. Even if a client is considered an eligible non-citizen, not every client is going to receive federal financial aid or enough federal financial aid to cover all of their education-related expenses. Strongly encourage you to still complete the FAFSA, since this is what so many other awards are based off of at different levels. Explore school-based merit and needs-based scholarship options. Explore private scholarship options, research supplemental financial aid opportunities for your state. Each state has their own process. Again, I know very closely. Maryland has a really fantastic supplemental opportunity here that students, majority of the information is based off of FAFSA being submitted. And so not that much additional information is needed in order to access additional financial aid. And then really encourage your students, if they're enrolled in high school, to talk to their counselors, financial aid advisors, or speak to the institution directly about additional ways to fund their education. Okay, so I know we have quite a few questions, so I'm going to hand it over to Meg, I believe, to moderate this. So we'll do our best to cover as much as possible. And as Meg mentioned earlier, we will be sending out, if we don't have time to cover everything, guidance related to additional questions.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. And I'm so thrilled to introduce our Q&A panelists. I'll hold off just one moment before I do, because I think it might make sense just to show again your slide related to eligible non-citizens, because I see a few questions that were more just looking for reiteration of that, that same list. So what I'm going to do is just put that slide up one more time before we get into the more detailed Q&A. So just as a point of clarification for anyone who wanted to see that list again, here you see the list that Lindsay spoke about at the very beginning. And I think this might be a good launching point as well for a question I saw come up in a few cases, which is related to Social Security numbers, because we know those can be challenging. So let me go ahead now and introduce our Q&A speakers, and maybe we'll kick us off with that question. So we're so thrilled to be joined today by two speakers from the Department of Education, Aaron Washington and David Bartnicki. Aaron is a management and program analyst at the Office of Postsecondary Education. David is a policy specialist at Federal Student Aid, or FSA. So like I mentioned, I did see a few questions related to Social Security numbers. Can any of our panelists speak to what steps providers should take in a case where a client does not have a Social Security number but is trying to complete the FAFSA?
Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Washington, and Lindsay went through the steps the students or the requirements that every student has to fulfill in order to receive Title IV federal student aid. And one of those requirements is a Social Security number. When you fill out the FAFSA, it does require you to enter a Social Security number. And then we do an automated match, you're automatically matched with the Social Security Administration to verify your name and date of birth. So that would be, in addition to being an eligible non-citizen, you would also be required to enter a valid Social Security number on the FAFSA. So if you don't have a Social Security number, or if you're waiting for a Social Security number, until you were conferred a Social Security number, you wouldn't have established eligibility for federal student aid.
Yeah, and I would just point out, based on some of the questions too, remember that a parent does not have to have a valid Social Security number or even a Social Security number at all. They might be a foreign national or something, but the student does require a valid Social Security number to ultimately become eligible for our federal student aid programs.
And we have some guidance in our on our studentaid.ed.gov website that walks you through how a parent could enter their information into the FAFSA in order to provide the proper information.
Great, thank you so much for that. A few questions that were quite popular related to income as that's reported on the FAFSA. So 4 areas of benefits. Can you speak to whether TANF, SNAP, reception and placement, or RMP, and matching grant, or MG funds need to be reported as income?
So the FAFSA, on the FAFSA, there is a question on whether you received means tested benefits, and so that would include TANF. And the reason that we ask the question is because we want to determine whether you qualify for a simplified needs test. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds in responding to these questions, because a lot of times when students ask questions, or we really refer them to their financial aid office to answer their specific questions. But a simplified needs test, or basically means that if you do receive a means tested benefit or a federal means tested benefit, and you make under a certain income threshold, we will ignore your assets when applying for federal student aid. So you may be eligible to receive more need-based aid, like a Pell Grant or a subsidized loan. And a subsidized loan would be that the federal government would cover the interest on your loan while you were enrolled in an eligible program at an institution. So there are certain means tested benefits that we ask about on the FAFSA, but that is really to determine whether you meet the requirements to qualify for those simplified needs tests.
Yeah, and I would point out too that the FAFSA itself, whether instructions on the hard copy or if you're doing FAFSA on the web, does a really good job of walking you through what income, what kind of assets you'll have to input. Often these type of questions have already been addressed, and they'll have chat features, they'll have instructions, they'll have notes that will help the participant fill that out. One thing I noticed, another question that was in there, someone said, well, how can I get help filling out a FAFSA form? One thing we like to stress is that we want it to be a free experience. There are different organizations out there. We want to make sure you know that we will help assist a participant fill out the FAFSA form. The school they're interested in can help them fill out the FAFSA form, other organizations as well. So we don't want them to incur any costs that they don't have to. 1-800-4-FED-AID, 1-800-4-FED-AID is our customer service center that can actually help a person individually walk through their FAFSA form. So that may be a good starting point, or the other websites that Lindsay mentioned as well in her presentation.
I just saw a pop-up too. Somebody said that the TRIO programs can help. They may be able to provide you, those are the federal TRIO programs. I myself participated in a few of them. I was Upward Bound. I participated in Upward Bound in high school and a McNair Scholars Program in college. And so you may be able to find help with federal TRIO programs as well.
Hey, Meg, if you don't mind, one point I wanted to make based upon a few comments, but I just want to make sure it's stressed too. Even if a person has a bachelor's degree, that does not mean they are ineligible for federal student aid. You can receive certain types of federal student aid, such as loans or work study for second bachelor's degrees, for associate degrees, certificate programs, even if you have a bachelor's. And yes, even if some of your students are entering graduate programs, they can receive federal direct loans and work study if they're otherwise eligible. So I know a lot of times we focus on the Pell Grant, but that's not the only program that these students may be eligible for. So wanted to point that out. Also, you can be less than half-time and receive certain types of federal student aid. The half-time requirement is only for federal student loans. So I want to point that out too, depending on the student's situation and how often they can go to school.
Great, that's a really important clarification. Thank you for that. So I see several questions related to other types of immigration statuses, in particular, some related to youth. So maybe as a broad question, I will just ask, what can we say about eligibility for special immigrant juveniles, unaccompanied refugee minors, including those who may be in federal foster care?
So I think at the beginning, well, at the beginning of the Q&A section, we went back to the slide where Lindsay discussed the categories of eligible non-citizens that are eligible to receive federal student aid. We know that there are other categories of eligible non-citizens in the United States currently. However, the department has, well, the Higher Education Act, which is the law that authorizes the federal student aid programs, states that an individual must be not only an eligible non-citizen, but also in the United States for other than a temporary purpose with the intention of becoming a lawful permanent resident or US citizen. And the department has interpreted that as the categories outlined that Lindsay outlined at the beginning of her presentation. And the law defines those groups as qualified aliens, and that's the Personal Responsibility and Workforce Act, Work Opportunity and Workforce Act. And so if you don't fall within one of those categories, consequently, you would not be eligible for federal student aid. So those that hold a special immigrant juvenile visa would not be eligible for federal student aid. I am not the most familiar with the unaccompanied refugee minor status. However, if you are granted or designated as a refugee by the Department of Homeland Security, you would meet our citizenship, non-citizenship requirement for eligibility, and you will be eligible for federal student aid if you were designated as a refugee, whether you were unaccompanied or not. And that would just be required you to, you know, submit your ARN on the FAFSA, and you would be matched with the Department of Homeland Security.
In that vein as well, just to mention, I saw a question regarding whether or not individuals unaccompanied refugee minors would need to report information regarding their foster parents. And I just want to confirm that they would not need to, because unless they are adopted, they would not be they would not be required to submit information regarding their parents. So they would include on those pre-qualified exemptions would say that they're currently in legal guardianship and would not be required to submit that information.
Yeah, and I want to point out too, of course, anyone who's applying for federal student aid has to meet all the other eligibility requirements. So obviously they would have to be of age where they're enrolled as a regular student in a college. When you say minor, some of these can be pretty young. So we are talking about post-secondary. I know there's other programs for younger children and so forth. Obviously, we're talking about federal aid for post-secondary education. I do want to point out, you mentioned the parent. I want to really stress this is important. Yes, I think some of these situations, the parents may not be available and may fall under those special circumstances that Lindsay talked about. However, if you do have a student who does have contact with their parents, maybe it was just the student who ended up falling under a certain status because of something they did or whatever, and they're here in the United States, but they still have a relationship with their parents, they're still in contact with their parents, and they don't meet any of the independent categories on the FAFSA form. You know, they're below 24, they're not married, they don't have a child, etc. They would still be dependent for federal student aid purposes, and therefore their parental information would have to be supplied on the FAFSA form. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
And we recognize this is a lot of information. And when you are completing the FAFSA, these questions are all laid out for you. And as David said in the beginning, there is help text on the FAFSA that helps you walk you through the process as well. So once you get to the dependency section, you will see you actually may not see those questions because we do have they might have you skip some questions, but you generally will be walked through the FAFSA using so while it's a lot of information that you're getting right now, I think once you get in there and start filling it out, all of this will hopefully make sense to you.
Yeah, and I'll point out too that, and I know it's in Lindsay's toolkit, which is great, some of the links. When we talk about the Federal Student Aid Handbook, when you go to the ifap.ed.gov website and you go to look up the handbook, there's a couple specific volumes that are really key in this. One is the application and verification guide, and that is going to walk you through from a school perspective, but it can also help you as you assist students filling out the FAFSA form. A lot of the questions around income and parental information and so forth. Another key chapter is Volume 1, Chapter 2, which is all things citizenship and eligible non-citizenship, and that is what your institutions will be referring to most often. So you have access to that data as well. And as Aaron mentioned, I think one of the best resources is going to be that financial aid office. Believe it or not, they have probably seen your situation before and have some idea. And if they don't, they have direct lines into our offices and other individuals who can help them.
Just a quick note on that as well. I saw a question earlier regarding can you access the questions and what information would be requested before, for instance, you're sitting down with a client to complete the application. And there you are able to access the full application online as a PDF. I would definitely strongly encourage you to encourage a client to look over that if they're able to, or walk them through a client through those questions with interpretation beforehand, so that they can start to gather some of that required information that's needed, so that when you're really sitting down to fill it out, hopefully you can get it through in one swift action. I know that's not always the case, but you can always save and return to that application, just ensuring that the client really maintains access to their passwords, their save keys, all of those things, so you can access the information that you've already been able to enter. And links to those forms are available in the toolkit as well.
Yeah, I actually have a FAFSA up on my screen, a PDF right now. So you just kind of open up a search engine and you can just type in FAFSA PDF and you can pull one up. If you really want to get the most up-to-date one, you can type in 2021, 2022 FAFSA. And so when you see that, you'll see over 100 questions. And that does not mean that you are going to have to answer every single one of those questions if you use fill out your FAFSA online or FAFSA on the web. So let's say you're over 24 years old, then there are about 10 or 11 questions in the dependency section that we've been talking about that you won't even see because you already qualify as an independent student. Or if you use the IRS data retrieval tool, if you file the United States tax return, if you use the data retrieval tool, that means you're giving the Department of Education permission to access your parents or your tax return transcript. Then there is also several questions that you won't be required to answer either. So, as Lindsay said, it's a really great resource just to look at the PDF to gather that information. But if you're using FAFSA on the web, you may not see every single question that you see in the PDF.
So one quick one.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Megan. Another question I'm seeing is the best way to track down parents' FSA information if they've changed their email or phone number. And I certainly understand the struggle and have been through that many times. If a client had created an FSA ID and can no longer access that means, and it's directly connected to their social security number, they can't create a new account because they've already have created an account with their social security number. In that situation, I would encourage you to reach out to the help desk and see if they're able to troubleshoot with you. Otherwise, I have had worked with clients where we've just printed it and signed it manually and sent it in for processing rather than using that online signature tool. So those are two options for you if you encounter that.
And the good thing now too with the FSA ID, we've added some additional ways to obtain your password if you forgot it. It's now can be tied to a mobile cell phone, which almost everybody has, even in a lot of different situations, or an email address. So hopefully that's helped a little bit too. I also wanted to point out that you may hear the term Title IV. Title IV is also federal student aid program. So I just wanted to make sure that if a school happens to say, oh, we participate in the Title IV programs, that they're talking about all the programs we're talking about today.
And can I just say one more thing too? I know, so when we're talking about immigration statuses, especially when you're talking, or designations, when you're talking to a financial aid administrator, they could be an expert on immigration statuses and designations, but there's a chance that they may not be. So you're not required to do this, but it could be a good idea just to familiarize yourself with the categories listed in our Federal Student Aid Handbook. They're also on our studentaid.ed.gov website or on IFAP, like David mentioned, just so you know the statuses that, because you may very well have that status that qualifies you for federal student aid. However, if you're saying, well, I have this status, or I received this documentation, or this is how I enter the United States, that may not be immediately identifiable to the financial aid administrator. So if you say I'm a lawful permanent resident, that may not be the terminology that you would use. Perhaps you would say I'm a permanent resident, or perhaps you would say something else, but it'd be helpful to familiarize yourself just with the categories, how they're listed in the Federal Student Aid Handbook. Again, that's not a requirement. It's just so you can go into the financial aid office and say, this is my status as that qualifies me to for Title IV federal student aid.
It's especially good to consider in terms of Afghan and Iraqi SIVs because there are other categories of special immigrant visas that are not considered eligible non-citizens. So really make sure that you're focusing on the fact that the individual has received a green card upon resettlement and would qualify through that means.
And I do want to point out too, from a technical reference standpoint, since everyone's referring to it, I should note that the IFAP webpage, IFAP, will be shutting down at the end of this month. FSA, my office, Federal Student Aid, is moving that to a different platform. We will redirect, however, individuals for a while. If you try to get on IFAP, we will redirect you to what we now are going to call the Knowledge Center. So I just didn't want anyone to freak out if they start to go to IFAP and it's sending them somewhere else. We are updating our platform.
These are all such great points. Thanks everyone for sharing. If I can pull out a couple of other common themes from the Q&A, I see several questions related to verification. So maybe 3 points on this that it would be great to hear perspectives on. Can we hear more about the who is selected to be verified for that verification process, how long it typically takes, and what we can do to support clients through what can be a confusing and challenging process?
Yeah, as far as verification, we, the department, have a process where we can select participants who fill out a FAFSA form. And currently that's around 18% or so, but that can vary. We have lots of different reasoning and analytics that go into choosing people for verification, which for a lot of good reasons we do not share. However, the likelihood of someone getting selected by verification overall is fairly low. And even if you do get selected, there are different categories that we potentially can place the student in. One of them is called V1, which we would look at basic income information along with some household size, number in college. We have another category called V4, which would only look at high school completion or statement or identity if we have concerns with that. And that's a very small percentage of our participants. And then we have V5, which would look at all of that information, both V1 plus V4. Now we can select, and we would we notify or present that information on the output documents that the schools receive and the students receive. So they will know they are selected for federal verification. However, don't forget that the schools can also self-select students if they have any concerns about any types of information, and they should have a policy spelled out in their policies and procedures on their websites and so forth. That process can take a fairly short amount of time or a fairly long amount of time, depending on the types of documents the school needs and how quickly the student and family can provide that information. Typically, I would say, several weeks go by as they're trying to gather the data and work with the student and family. But there's no set time frame. We do have ultimate timeframes or maximum deadlines that information does have to be provided when the school is working with the student, which can vary based on the student situation, but not all of these students are going to be selected for verification. So I don't want anyone going out there assuming that if you enroll in a college, you're automatically going to have to provide all this information. Now that's just for verification. On the flip side, because I hear a lot about high school completion and concerns around some of that. Some of that information may be required by the school itself in their admissions policy, which is totally separate from the Department of Education's requirements for federal student aid. So keep that in mind as well.
I think something, while we hear it's a small percentage, at least in my work, it seems like almost half of my students end up getting selected for verification for some reason. So I definitely understand the struggle around that. And I think, using this information and trying to understand as best as possible of what the institution is looking for, and just having that in the back of your mind so that when those questions come up, you're able to, access that documentation if it's available, or, go to one of these written statement templates to fill out things and provide that is hopefully will help in that process of understanding the policy behind those requests. Yeah, I guess that's what I'll stop with.
If you pull up a search engine as well, you can type in suggested text verification. We provide, every year, we provide schools with suggested text to help students complete verification. The schools are not required to use the suggested text, but we just provide it to them each year as like a guide. And if they do use it, that will help, the suggested text fulfills all of the verification requirements depending on what tracking group you're, depending on if you're selected for V1, V4, V5. And so if you are selected for verification, I think the main thing to do is to work with your institution, but you can also look at that suggested text to see what the school may ask you to provide if you are selected.
Mm-hmm. And just doing the research beforehand as best as possible to understand potentially what those deadlines could look like, as well as when you submit that, when you have those meetings with the client to submit the application, of just laying out, these are some potential documents that you may be requested. Take this time in between to try to gather, make sure at least you have access to those, because they can be incredibly quick turnarounds. And it's not only, the client trying to get that information, but also you yourself with all of the other responsibilities that you have of making sure that you're supporting them through that process. So I think forward planning, being over prepared is, a great thing for this sort of situation, just so that when those requests are made, you're able to meet them in the deadlines that are required.
Great. I see a couple questions related to maybe stepping outside of the strictly student aid category into scholarships. Are any of the panelists aware of scholarship opportunities for ORR-eligible clients that should be explored?
I know that there are a few. If you Google, in the past I've Googled, and there's a list that comes up of organization-based scholarships for those individuals. Something maybe not specific to ORR populations, but a lot of schools will provide needs-based scholarships as well for communities that have been disadvantaged in a variety of different qualifiers. So looking into those opportunities as well is a great option. Working with those, whether it's a TRIO office on campus, your high school counselor, financial aid offices at the institution, all of those are great resources to explore what other opportunities might be available to a client. They will be great resources in understanding what's available within that local community and within that state, because there's such a variety across the country in terms of what's available. We're not able to get into those specifics, but certainly would really encourage you to access those different resources, because they are there to help ensure clients are able to fund their education.
Yeah, those are great points. And we in the department don't provide specific guidance around other scholarships, but as noted, working with the financial aid office at the institution often is a good beginning point, because they have worked with lots of different students in different situations. They have ties to the local communities and so forth. And one thing to point out is, even if someone's not eligible for federal student aid for whatever reason, maybe they don't meet our specified immigration statuses as we've outlined, that does not necessarily mean that they're not eligible for state aid, school aid, local aid, private scholarships, etc. There are lots of other entities that may be reaching out to those specific groups as well. So
I believe most states at this point have like a promise scholarship that's eligible or available to clients pursuing a community college associate's degree. And so definitely looking into those options. Typically our clients will be eligible to or individuals will be eligible to receive that if they aren't receiving federal student aid or aren't able to cover the cost of a community college with their federal student aid award.
oh, we can't. I can't hear you, Meg.
I can't hear.
about that? Are you able to hear me all right?
Yes.
You're back.
Sorry about that. Maybe a final question, maybe good timing, as it looks like we're getting towards the end of our time as well. I do see a few specific questions related to individual situations, quite specific to personal circumstances or circumstances related to cases within a school. I think for those, we might recommend some of the additional resources we shared. If anyone on the panel would like to, share any further thoughts on those individual questions, don't hesitate to type out responses to any of those. But one broad question that I think will be of interest to many people on today's call relates to multilingual support. Lindsay, you mentioned interpretation and your process for using interpretation with clients as they go through this process. Can anyone share any recommendations for potentially existing multilingual resources that clients can access to help learn about federal student aid, or strategies such as working with interpreters that can help those who are English language learners?
We'll pass it. This is actually a question that I would have for David and Aaron. Do you know if federal student aid offices are required to provide interpretation under some of those federal requirements?
I mean, our particular guidance, we do have some publications and information in Spanish. But that's about the only other language besides English that we're publishing our documents. As far as the school requirements, if you provide certain documents in a foreign language, the school does not have the ability to interpret what that is saying. It ultimately does have to be translated. So sometimes the schools are able to do it in their foreign language programs or assistance that they have. Otherwise, families may have to provide that documentation translated so that the financial aid office can see what is actually being presented. Is this really a high school diploma? Is this really, whatever type of document they're trying to provide, because they don't understand that specific language. But I'm not aware of any services that we specifically provide within the department to assist schools to do that. I don't know if Aaron knows of anything.
I'm not.
Something to note on what David said as well is really making sure that you understand the institution's requirements for the translation of those documents as well, whether that's something that they're comfortable with a client translating, that can be a situation, or if it needs to be through a certified translation service that I know that we're all quite familiar with, of pre-qualified individuals that have been vetted to provide that service. So just making sure that you understand the requirements of the institution. In terms of working with clients, I was fortunate enough to have access to interpretation through the VOLAG that I worked with. In terms of other efforts, I'm not aware of them at the moment, but I'm happy to explore, and maybe we can send that out with some additional resources as a follow-up.
I wanted to clarify something that I said earlier. When I said the law that we follow for determining our categories of eligible non-citizen, I think I mixed up some of the words. So I just wanted to say it's the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron and David, for participating in this Q&A, and Lindsay as well. Before everyone signs off, I see we have about 90 seconds left, so let's do a quick wrap up. So you will see a link to our feedback survey in the chat now. This is hugely helpful to Switchboard as we work to make our trainings more useful to you in the future. So please do take a few minutes to quickly fill out that survey. It will ask you whether you feel we achieve these learning objectives. So defining key terms, summarizing financial aid opportunities, understanding how the FAFSA is used, going through some common obstacles, as well as sharing some useful resources. So please let us know how we did today. We would also like to conclude with a final poll. So you'll recall at the beginning, we asked you about your level of confidence in obtaining financial aid. It'll have just popped up on your screen now. So let's give about 15 seconds to see how people are feeling at the conclusion. Great. So I see that we're more in the 3 and 4 category in our bell curve here. So we really are glad to see that some of you are feeling more confident in supporting clients and obtaining financial aid. And finally, I'm sharing Switchboard's contact information. So switchboard@rescue.org is our email. You have our website and our social media here. As a final note and a reminder, you will receive over email a link to the slides, the recording, the toolkit we spoke about, as well as some additional Q&A responses from all the great questions we received today. So if we didn't get to your question during this session, take a look at that, and we will do our best to answer everything that we missed. And with that, I will wrap up today's training and share a huge thank you to our participants for joining and sharing all your great questions and ideas via the chat, to our facilitator, Lindsay, our panelists, David and Aaron, and my co-host, Rebecca Mulqueen. Thanks so much, all.